Thank you for inviting me to be part of this very interesting session, and I apologise for not being able to be there in person. I think the sophistication of the interdisciplinary design techniques that you've just heard about, and also numerous other scientific developments under the heading of synthetic biology, could make an enormous contribution to society, to various problems in healthcare, food production, energy-related initiatives. But to get there, we'll need to develop a much more proactive and integrative approach to the governance of these technologies than we've managed to achieve so far. So what I want to do in this talk is to explore the kinds of regulatory problems that have arisen for synthetic biology products in the past, and the kind of research my colleagues and I have been doing here in Edinburgh in the Inogen Institute to fix these problems, and also some recent developments that we've been successful in initiating through the UK government that might make a difference in the long run. So moving to the first slide, this is just one small example to illustrate the kinds of problems that arise for genetically modified, gene-edited synthetic biology products here in the European Union. I could write 10 books about the delays and inhibitions to potentially useful products that have happened, first for GM and then synthetic biology-related innovations. But perhaps just one example will do, and this is the genetically modified gene-edited crops in Europe. This is a picture of the first ever publicly consumed CRISPR cabbage meal that took place in Europe in 2018. This was in the regulatory hiatus that existed before the European Union had decided how it was going to regulate gene-edited crops. Having made the decision to regulate gene-edited crops as if they were GM technologies, genetic modification, put them through the full European regulatory system, that means that this kind of meal could no longer legally be eaten in public in Europe, and it has in fact put a big stop to a lot of developments that could be happening in Europe in this area while Europe works this out. It's not just Europe that has these problems. If you look at what happens in the United States with the regulation of gene-edited animals, where GM salmon, GM cattle are put through a regulatory system that normally applies to drugs, which is causing quite a few problems for these technologies. So moving on to the next slide, this shows the framework that we've developed in the Inogen Institute for doing research on these kinds of questions since about 2002. We've studied all three of these constituencies, the scientists and innovators, policymakers and regulators, and stakeholders and citizens. We study them separately and study how they interact with one another across a whole range of different technologies, as illustrated up on the left-hand side of this slide. So we look at the interactions between these three constituencies, and it's actually the interactions that determine what products get developed at the end of the day, where they get developed, in what countries, how they're regulated, and which countries are able to develop them in which parts of the world. So where the technology moves to will be the place where the regulation is most comfortable for the technology that's being developed. And if you look at the three constituencies, the governance process, the regulatory systems, are those that are devised by policymakers and regulators to apply to scientists and innovators. The stakeholders and citizens interact with the policymakers generally through an advocacy process. They lobby for different kinds of regulations for different products, or they lobby for regulations to be less demanding so that products can get through the regulatory system more easily. And the scientists and innovators interact with the citizens directly through markets, and that's a more direct relationship with the technology. So moving on to the next slide, this shows the problems that innovative technologies have in reaching a marketplace. And looking at the two dogs, you may not spot the small one in the bottom left-hand corner of the diagram. The point this makes is that no matter what this little dog does, no matter how much he eats, he's never going to grow up to be the big guy. In fact, the big guy is much more likely to eat him. And this illustrates the problem I mentioned in the context of the last slide with the problems with innovative technologies and the fact that the more time-consuming and expensive you make the regulatory system, the more the control of the innovation trajectories passes to big multinational companies. They're the only ones who can afford to meet the challenges of the regulatory system. And this means that radical disruptive innovation that would challenge the business models of the incumbent multinational companies generally doesn't get off the ground. So if a small company wants to sell its product or its IP or to form a partnership with a big multinational company, they're going to have to be developing something that that multinational company wants to use. And big multinationals don't usually like disruptive innovation which won't fit into their current business models. So the end result of all of this is that the basic science that we do in life sciences leads to a disproportionate amount of incremental innovation and not nearly as much disruptive innovation. That's something that completely changes the way we're doing things, than you would expect from that amount of public investment in the science. And up until now, there's been no pressure on regulators to find new ways to regulate innovative technologies that will deal with this kind of problem. What they do when they're faced with a new technology is they reach for something a bit like the multinational companies. They want to use something that's already in their portfolio. They don't want to have to develop a whole new regulatory system every time a new technology comes along. So they look for a regulatory precedent. And in Europe, when they had to think about how to regulate GM crops, and in America, they thought in terms of the regulatory systems that currently existed for the agrochemical industry. And likewise, for GM animals, it was the regulatory systems for new drugs and so on. And so this leads to a lot of problems where the regulatory systems are out of keeping with the properties of today's innovative technologies. They don't fit. And what we do really is we say to the regulators say to companies, you've got to make your technology fit with our regulatory systems. Whereas what they should be doing is saying, we'll adapt our regulatory systems to fit with the needs of the new technologies. And another aspect of these very long lead times for an innovation getting from conception to marketplace is that stakeholder advocacy groups have plenty of time to mobilize and develop highly effective campaigns against technologies that don't fit with their worldview. So you see this happening in life sciences in a way that it doesn't happen in information and communication technologies, for example, because with ICT, the product's there on the marketplace before people have had time to think about whether they want it or not. And if they don't buy it, of course, it fails. But if they do buy it, then it might take off with problems that we might have wanted to fix if we'd known about it in time, and so on. This next slide focuses on the points about disruptive innovation and incremental innovation and the different ways in which we should regulate them. It was developed from a project called Proportionate and Adaptive Governance of Innovative Technologies that arose from a project we were funded from the UK government to do. We had been saying for a very long time that there were problems with regulatory systems and how they were inhibiting innovative technologies, and the government asked us to develop a framework that would demonstrate what they could do about it in their regulatory system. So that this is intended to show how this could be done. And what we proposed was that you needed to take a different approach for disruptive innovation and incremental innovation. That's the arrows on the right-hand side of the diagram. And that also you needed to incorporate proportionality and adaptation into your regulatory systems. That's adaptation to the needs of new technologies and proportionality to the risks of the new technologies. That you should think about the development process as sequential, starting in this diagram we're talking about technology readiness levels. If you're not familiar with that term, it's a way of describing how close the technology is to market from its original origins as a research initiative. So TRLs 1 to 3 are right at the very beginning when you're still doing the basic research, and by TRL 9 at the bottom of this diagram, you're ready to go to market. And what we're saying, just to put it very simply, is that at the beginning, you don't start when you're still doing the basic research, trying to work out how you're going to regulate this technology. You wait till it's reached about TRL 6 or 7 before you decide how you're going to regulate it. And you keep it safe up till that point using a creative approach to standards and guidelines that will make sure it remains safe, doesn't cause any future problems, and also begins to experiment with different ways that it might be useful to regulate this technology rather than jumping to whichever regulatory system happens to be most convenient for the regulator that thinks it's going to end up regulating this technology, and so on. You do have standards and guidelines beyond the decision about regulation at the bottom of the diagram. These are the kind of standards and guidelines that we have today for most products, which are helping companies to work out how they should meet the requirements of the regulator. So it's a different kind of standard and guideline from the ones we're talking about up at the top of the diagram. And the vertical arrows labelled RI and RR, that stands for responsible research and responsible innovation. And that relates to the fact that if you're actually going to try to get public acceptance for a process that makes life easier, particularly for big multinational companies, at least in some parts of the world, you may not get public acceptance for that very readily. And making sure that you have a way of demonstrating that companies are going to behave responsibly under these new regulatory regimes is going to be an important part of the overall process. So we also developed something to fit into that area. Then moving on to the next slide, I've been a member of the UK Prime Minister's Council on Science and Technology for the last 3 years. I think the closest US equivalent to this is the US President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology. I'm not sure if that still exists, but I know it did exist under President Obama. And it had a very similar role to this UK Prime Minister's Council on Science and Technology. And as a member of that, I was able to put a policy process through their procedures, which ended up resulting in a letter to the Prime Minister that suggested that the following regulatory approaches should be put in place to help deal with these problems of regulating innovative technologies. So they recommended a ministerial working group on future regulation to create the regulatory environment for future innovations to flourish, a strategic horizon scanning function, a regulators pioneer fund that gives regulators up to £1 million a time if they have an innovative technology that they're not quite sure how to regulate it and how to make it work. Then they have some money to help them to develop an effective regulatory system. There's going to be a one-stop shop for regulatory advice for companies and investors to give them confidence to bring their ideas to market. And overall, there's an organisation called the Better Regulation Executive in the UK government, which is going to lead on examining how regulation and standards can be designed to enable innovation and to coordinate the whole process. And these recommendations were accepted within 2 weeks by the UK government, so it was a very fast process. They fell on very receptive ears, and there is now a white paper published last June on regulation for the fourth industrial revolution, setting out the government's intentions to develop all these initiatives, and they're actually being put in place one by one, piecemeal. You're seeing one or two coming out every month or so. There's something new happening. So the link at the bottom of this slide gives the link to the white paper on the government's website, and you can take a look at it and see how it's working. The next slide is about the responsible innovation ideas. This is a little bit further behind in actual implementation. The idea about responsible innovation, as synthetic biologists working in the United States, you might remember the ELSI initiative, ELSI, and that was ethical, legal, and socioeconomic implications of innovative technologies. And that trajectory lasted for quite a long time in UK and American government circles. There was a lot of funding for social scientists under this heading. In the European Union, responsible innovation is the next generation funding stream for social scientists to work on these issues of responsibility, following on from the ELSI funding round that preceded it. And there's been very strong pressure from academic communities and governments for companies to innovate responsibly, but companies have been very nervous about the kinds of costs and delays in innovation processes that this might create, and also about the potential to open themselves up to orchestrated advocacy campaigns that they might not be able to control. The spectre of the GM crops public rejection in Europe is still a very strong influence on company thinking in all areas around life sciences. So this is an area where companies were reluctant to take up responsible innovation for this reason. Arising from the funding that the Paget projects that you saw in the previous slide, we were funded by the UK government through the British Standards Institution to develop a standard for responsible innovation that would fit with the needs of companies, would encourage companies to feel comfortable with this process, basically. And I've been the technical author for this standard. It's PAS 440 is its identification number. PAS stands for Publicly Available Specification. So it's not a full formal standard. It's a very rapid way of getting a new potential standard out into the public domain quickly, getting it used by companies, and if it is used by companies and appreciated by them, then the next stage in the development will be the development of a formal standard with an accreditation system from a standards body like the BSI and so on. The sentence on the slide is the section from the introduction to this standard that explains its value to companies and so on. I don't have much more that I can share about it just yet. It's the final draft has been submitted to the publisher in the BSI, and it's going to be publicly available towards the end of March this year, I think, and we're hoping that it will help companies not just to behave responsibly, but to demonstrate publicly that they're behaving responsibly, and to do so very rapidly if they're challenged in any way, so that they have everything ready to hand to demonstrate that they've been responsible in the development of the technologies. And we think this will actually help companies to feel comfortable about it. So that's what we've been doing in the UK. Just to sum up, we're saying there's a need for interdisciplinarity in creating the best innovation ecosystem for the delivery of the benefits of synthetic biology, that linking innovation trajectories to regulatory systems and stakeholder perspectives and making sure that they're well integrated and compatible with one another is the way to move forward. that there's a need to be much more politically proactive about the role of regulators in supporting innovations that can meet societal needs. For example, particularly in the context of climate change, in recent publicly high-profile public issues that are happening where synthetic biology can have a big role. You need to link public responsible innovation, company responsible innovation, to the need for public acceptance. And these policy innovations in the UK are targeting not just the life sciences, but all innovative technologies. So it's going to be interesting to see how they play out in the context of artificial intelligence and social media, as well as in synthetic biology, and also how they survive the Brexit chaos here in the UK. But they are being watched by others internationally. There was a presentation at last year's Davos conference about this new approach from the British government, and it's other countries and governments are expressing an interest in this approach. So I think it might be something that will have some shelf life in the future. Thank you very much.